The restaurant was silent before it ever should have been. It was the kind of silence that didn't belong in a room full of chandeliers, laughter, and music. A silence that arrives too early, like a storm cloud drifting in on a summer afternoon. At the center of it all, under the glare of golden light, stood a woman wrapped in diamonds. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and cold, every word designed to pierce. "You're done here. Fired. Right now." The tray in the waitress's hands trembled. Glasses rattled, a drop of red wine slipped down the rim of a crystal flute, staining her white apron in dark blotches. Her eyes darted for a second, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But all she found were stares. Dozens of them. Some looked away in pity, uncomfortable with the cruelty unfolding in front of them. Others smirked, entertained by the spectacle. And somewhere in the mix were whispers, quick and cutting, as if humiliation itself had an echo. The wealthy woman's jewels sparkled as she tilted her chin, eyes narrowed in satisfaction. She wasn't simply removing someone from her post. She was performing a show of power in the middle of a crowded room. "Get out," she added, her hand waving toward the door as though dismissing a servant at a royal court. "Get out before you embarrass yourself further." The waitress's chest rose and fell. Her throat tightened, but no words came. For a moment, she thought about running. About disappearing through the kitchen doors, tearing off her apron, and never coming back. But then something shifted. Small. Almost invisible. The kind of change only seen by those who were really watching. Her trembling hands grew still. Her back straightened. And her eyes, though quiet, carried a strength that refused to break. People noticed. A murmur swept across the tables. Why wasn't she crying? Why wasn't she begging for her job, pleading to be spared this public humiliation? The wealthy woman noticed too. That calm, that refusal to crumble, unsettled her more than tears ever could. The waitress's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Silence became her weapon. In a room that thrived on noise, on the clinking of silverware and the laughter of the rich, silence was louder than any shout. She placed the tray down slowly, carefully, almost ceremoniously, as if she were lowering something sacred onto an altar. Not rushed. Not panicked. Just steady. The wealthy woman's eyes narrowed further. This wasn't the reaction she wanted. She wanted desperation. She wanted tears. She wanted the crowd to see her power reflected in the broken spirit of someone beneath her. Instead, the crowd was seeing something else entirely. Dignity in the face of cruelty. And it made her uncomfortable. The waitress stepped back. Her shoes squeaked lightly against the polished floor. Her gaze swept across the room. She saw the faces of strangers who had watched it all unfold. Some sympathetic. Some cruel. All witnesses. And though she felt her heart beating hard in her chest, though humiliation burned hot under her skin, she stood tall. The wealthy woman broke the silence with a scoff, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Pathetic," she muttered, loud enough for the closest tables to hear. The word hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. But even then, the waitress did not flinch. For those watching, it was impossible not to wonder. What was holding her together? Why didn't she collapse under the weight of the moment? They leaned forward, waiting, anticipating, sensing that behind her calm was something hidden, something unspoken that no one yet understood. The waitress finally reached for the string of her apron. Her fingers untied the knot slowly, deliberately. The fabric loosened and fell into her hands. She folded it neatly, smoothing the creases, as though even in this moment she would not abandon her sense of order, her discipline, her pride. Then she set it gently on the counter. The wealthy woman raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. To her, this was nothing but defiance, a last attempt at saving face. But to everyone else it was something different. A quiet declaration that humiliation would not define her. That even stripped of her position, she would not be stripped of her dignity. The tension in the room was unbearable. You could feel it in the stillness of the guests, in the way forks hovered just above plates, forgotten. You could feel it in the way the piano player had stopped mid-song, hands frozen above the keys. The wealthy woman tapped her diamond bracelet against her wine glass, trying to reclaim control of the moment. The chime rang out, but it did nothing to erase the silence pressing in around her. She turned her attention back to the waitress, smirking as if to say, "You'll regret this." But the waitress did not look at her. She looked past her, past the glitter and the jewels and the arrogance. She looked into the room itself, into the sea of faces. And without words, she reminded every single person of something they had forgotten. Power may humiliate, but it cannot erase truth. A child at one table tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Why is she being mean to the lady?" he whispered, his innocence piercing sharper than any adult's judgment. The mother hushed him quickly, embarrassed, but the question lingered in the air. "Why indeed?" The waitress turned, her footsteps slow as she began moving toward the exit. But there was no sense of defeat in her walk. Only resolve. She knew the wealthy woman thought she had won. She knew the crowd assumed this was the end of her story. Yet somewhere deep inside, she carried something greater than they could see. And that's when the truth settled in the air, unspoken but heavy. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The audience didn't know it yet, but the calm in her eyes wasn't emptiness. It was the calm of someone holding a secret. A truth so powerful it could turn the room upside down. A truth the wealthy woman would soon be forced to face. And as the waitress reached the door, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. What could possibly be hiding behind her silence? The wealthy woman leaned back in her chair, satisfied, her smile a mask of victory. Around her, friends chuckled softly, the sound cruel and careless, as if someone's livelihood was nothing more than tonight's entertainment. She raised her glass, tilting the ruby-red wine toward her lips, and whispered to the woman seated beside her. "That's what happens when staff forget their place." The words were laced with arrogance, designed to cement her dominance, to remind everyone watching who held the power. The restaurant stirred back to life, but it wasn't the same. Conversations resumed in fragments, laughter strained and uneasy. Still, the tension hadn't left. It lingered like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. By the kitchen doors, the waitress stood still, apron folded in her hands, back rigid, face unreadable. She wasn't gone yet. She wasn't broken. And that unsettled people. Behind her, the staff whispered. A young busboy, no older than 19, shook his head. "Why now? She didn't deserve that." Another server muttered, "She's the hardest worker here. She covers shifts, never complains." Their voices were hushed, careful not to carry too far. In this place, silence was survival. Everyone knew the wealthy woman had influence. She dined here weekly. She knew the owner by name. She had the kind of money that bought loyalty, the kind of money that made people turn away when things didn't feel right. And so, the injustice sat heavy in the air. The wealthy woman's power loomed like a shadow, daring anyone to speak up. None did. Not yet. The waitress untied her apron completely now, folding it once more, each movement deliberate, calm. It was a ritual. A way to hold on to dignity when everything else was being stripped away. Around her, people watched. Their forks hovered. Their eyes darted between her and the wealthy woman, as though waiting for someone to shatter the unbearable silence again. The wealthy woman, emboldened by her own cruelty, leaned forward. "Honestly," she said loudly enough for several tables to hear, "I don't know why the owner hires people like her. No class. No training. No presence." She sipped her wine, savoring it like the taste of victory. Her words landed heavy, cruel, and cutting. Each syllable intended not only to dismiss but to erase. But the waitress didn't react. She didn't defend herself. She didn't bow her head. She stood steady, her face calm, her silence louder than any outburst could ever be. Then, from the far side of the room, a small sound broke the tension. A note. A single piano key struck gently, almost uncertainly. Heads turned toward the corner, where the pianist, an older man in a black suit, sat watching the waitress. He had stopped playing earlier when the firing had turned the restaurant into a stage for cruelty. Now, he lifted his hands again, striking a chord, then another, his eyes never leaving hers. The wealthy woman frowned, irritated. Why is he still playing? The show's over. But the pianist ignored her. Instead, he gestured subtly toward the empty bench beside him, nodding at the waitress. It was a gesture of invitation, of recognition. The room stirred again. A murmur passed through the tables. Guests leaned in, curious, confused. The waitress froze, caught off guard. She hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge her, let alone offer her a chance to stand again in front of the very crowd that had just watched her be torn down. The wealthy woman's face twisted in annoyance. "Don't tell me you're asking her to," but before she could finish, the pianist stood, moving aside, offering the seat fully to the waitress. His hand gestured firmly now, insistently. The restaurant shifted. People straightened in their chairs. Whispers filled the air. "What's happening? Why's he calling her up?" Curiosity replaced discomfort, but the wealthy woman's smirk only deepened. "This should be good," she muttered, rolling her eyes. The waitress hesitated. Every part of her body screamed to leave, to walk out the doors and never look back. Yet something else, something deeper, held her in place. Slowly, almost cautiously, she stepped forward. Her shoes tapped lightly against the polished floor as she crossed the dining room, the spotlight of every gaze following her. She approached the piano. Her fingers brushed the edge of the bench, hesitant, trembling. She glanced at the pianist, and he nodded, his expression calm, almost knowing. For a long moment, the waitress stood there, suspended between humiliation and defiance. The wealthy woman chuckled under her breath, loud enough for her table to hear. "This is ridiculous. She thinks she can sit there and, what? Entertain us." Her friend snickered, eager to mirror her cruelty. But the rest of the room was silent, waiting. The air was heavy, electric, as though something unseen was about to break open. The waitress's eyes scanned the crowd. She saw the smirks, the pity, the indifference. But she also saw something else. Anticipation. A hunger for something they didn't yet know they needed. Her chest rose with a deep breath. And then, slowly, she lowered herself onto the bench. The wealthy woman leaned back, smirking, certain this would end in embarrassment. But the pianist, standing just behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder for a brief moment, a silent transfer of strength. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The room waited, breathless. And though she hadn't yet played a note, the energy had already shifted. Something was building, something unseen, something the wealthy woman couldn't control. The wealthy woman's smirk faltered for the first time. And in that fragile pause, just before the first note, the audience realized they were no longer watching a firing. They were watching the beginning of a revelation. The silence stretched, long and heavy, as her fingers hovered above the piano keys. You could hear the faint hum of the chandeliers overhead, the soft rattle of cutlery abandoned on plates, the faint cough of someone clearing their throat in the far corner. But no one moved. No one dared to. The wealthy woman crossed her arms, her bracelets clinking together, her lips curled into a mocking smile. "Go on then," she whispered, though loud enough for several tables to hear. "Let's see how the little waitress makes a fool of herself." The waitress took in a slow breath. Her chest rose, her shoulders fell, and then her hands descended. The first notes were gentle, delicate, like water trickling down stone. They floated into the air, soft and pure, weaving their way through the tense room. People blinked, startled. It wasn't the fumbling sound of someone pretending, of someone trying to impress. It was music. Real music. The kind that reaches beyond ears and settles straight into the heart. The wealthy woman's smile faltered, but only for a second. She sat up straighter, feigning disinterest, sipping her wine with exaggerated calm. "Beginner's luck," she muttered. But the music didn't stop. It deepened. It swelled. The waitress's fingers danced across the keys, faster now, confident, strong. The soft beginning gave way to a flood of sound, rich and commanding, filling every corner of the restaurant until it seemed the walls themselves were listening. Gasps rose from the crowd. One man whispered, "That's Chopin." Another corrected him quietly, "Beethoven." Then came murmurs, growing louder, spreading like wildfire. "She trained. She studied somewhere. She's not just a waitress." The wealthy woman shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around as if to measure the crowd's reaction. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had staged humiliation, but instead, she had built a stage for something she couldn't control. The waitress's eyes were closed now, lost in the music. Each note carried more than sound. It carried story. The rise and fall of joy and sorrow, of sacrifice and struggle, of resilience pressed into every chord. People leaned forward, entranced. A woman at one table dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, whispering to her husband, "It's beautiful." Even the children who had grown restless earlier sat perfectly still, their small faces reflecting awe. The wealthy woman gripped her glass tighter. Her hand trembled, and wine sloshed against the rim. She set it down hard, the thud loud in the brief pause between chords. Heads turned toward her, but she forced a laugh. "What's the big deal? Anyone can learn a few notes." Her words were brittle, her voice edged with panic. But then the waitress shifted again. The piece transformed. It wasn't just classical anymore. It was her own melody now. Raw, alive, unmistakably hers. It surged with emotion, with the kind of honesty that couldn't be faked. The room was no longer a restaurant. It was a theater. A sanctuary. A place where truth broke free from silence. The wealthy woman's facade cracked. She leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to mask the shock any longer. Her diamonds, her jewels, her power, all of it meant nothing in this moment. She was just another face in the crowd, staring at a woman she had tried to erase, now shining brighter than anyone in the room. The whispers grew louder, no longer whispers at all. "Juilliard," someone breathed. "She left to care for her mother," another said, the story spilling out in fragments known by a few but hidden from most. And in those fragments, the room pieced together the truth. This wasn't just a waitress. This was a musician, an artist, a soul too big for the uniform she wore. The music built to a climax, the waitress's hands moving with impossible speed, her entire body alive with the force of it. And when the final note struck, sharp and clear, the sound hung in the air for a long, trembling moment before dissolving into silence. Then came the eruption. Applause thundered through the restaurant. Chairs scraped back as people stood, clapping, cheering, shouting for more. Some wiped tears, others simply stared in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The wealthy woman sat frozen. Her hands clutched the edge of the table, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. The crowd wasn't looking at her anymore. They weren't laughing at her jokes or admiring her wealth. They were looking at the woman she had tried to humiliate, now elevated before them all. The waitress stood slowly, her face calm once again, but this time her calm was different. It wasn't the silence of someone enduring humiliation. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had revealed their truth, someone who no longer needed to prove anything. She bowed once, briefly, then stepped away from the piano. The pianist, still standing off to the side, clapped softly, his eyes filled with pride. He knew what the others had only just discovered, that greatness can hide in unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The wealthy woman tried to speak, her lips parting, but no words came. She had been silenced in the most powerful way possible. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with undeniable talent, with dignity, with truth. And as the waitress walked away from the piano, the entire room understood what they had just witnessed, the reversal of power, the transformation of humiliation into triumph. But this story wasn't over yet, because while the applause still echoed through the room, one question hung in the air, unanswered. What would the wealthy woman do now? The applause rolled on like a storm. It didn't fade quickly, like polite clapping at the end of a dinner show. It swelled, wave after wave, rising from every corner of the restaurant until it felt as though the building itself might shake. People stood, some whistling, some shouting, others simply pressing their hands together, eyes wet with tears. The waitress stood at the piano's edge, still, calm, humbled but unshaken. She bowed her head once, a gesture of gratitude, then began to step away. But the wealthy woman did not stand. She sat frozen, her jaw tight, her hands clutching the arms of her chair as though she might fall without their support. Her diamonds glittered under the chandeliers, but they had lost their luster. Her wealth, her influence, her carefully curated presence, none of it mattered now. All eyes had shifted away from her. For the first time in years, she was invisible. She tried to scoff, to laugh, to dismiss what she had seen. But the sound caught in her throat. Because the truth was undeniable. The woman she had fired in front of everyone, the woman she had called unworthy, untrained, without class, had just filled the room with brilliance that no one could ignore. The waitress walked calmly toward the exit, her shoes clicking against the polished floor, each step steady, unhurried. It wasn't the walk of someone defeated. It was the walk of someone free. The owner of the restaurant burst through the crowd, chasing after her. "Wait, please." His voice trembled with urgency. "You can't leave like this. You belong here more than anyone." The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding, some even calling out, "Stay! Play again." But the waitress only shook her head gently, her eyes kind, her voice soft yet firm. "No, I don't belong here. I know my worth, and I won't let it be defined by someone else's cruelty." Her words struck deeper than the music had. They carried weight, truth, the kind of lesson that burns into memory. The wealthy woman's cheeks flushed. She slammed her hand against the table, desperate to regain control. "Do you hear this? She's being dramatic. She's just—" But the words faltered. No one was listening anymore. Her friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to defend her now. The applause, the whispers, the stares, they weren't hers anymore. The room had chosen its hero, and it wasn't her. The waitress gave one final glance at the crowd. Not a look of triumph, not a smirk of revenge. Just gratitude. Gratitude for being seen, for being heard, for being allowed to reveal who she truly was. Then she turned, pushed open the heavy doors, and disappeared into the night. The wealthy woman sat in silence, her hands trembling. The noise of the restaurant crept back in slowly, but it wasn't the same as before. Laughter no longer flowed toward her table. Admiring glances no longer turned her way. Instead, people whispered about the woman who had just left, about the secret she carried, about the dignity she refused to surrender. And in that silence, the wealthy woman felt something she had not felt in years. Shame. It burned hot across her skin, searing deeper than her pride could cover. She had money, yes. She had power, influence, the kind of clout that could silence employees and bend owners to her will. But none of that mattered here. Not anymore. Because she had been exposed. She had been revealed not as powerful, but as small. Hours later, when the lights dimmed and the last guests trickled out, she sat alone at her table, her untouched wine glass before her. The applause still echoed in her ears. But not for her. Never for her. She remembered the look in the waitress's eyes. Calm, unbroken, powerful in a way that diamonds could never imitate. And for the first time, she wondered if all her wealth had done nothing but blind her to what truly mattered. That night, she returned to her mansion, its halls lined with marble, its rooms glittering with treasures collected from every corner of the world. But for once, the silence inside those walls felt suffocating. Her wealth couldn't drown out the memory of the music. It couldn't erase the image of a woman standing tall in the face of humiliation. And somewhere in that silence, the truth became clear. Money could buy comfort, could buy luxury, it could even buy power, but it could never buy respect. It could never buy dignity. Those were earned, not purchased. And those who tried to strip them away from others only revealed how little they had themselves. The wealthy woman had wanted to make the waitress small. Instead, she had been forced to see just how small she herself had become. The lesson was heavy, humbling, undeniable. True worth is never defined by uniforms, by status, or by what others choose to see. True worth is the fire within us, the dignity we carry, the talent and truth that no one can erase. And for those who watched that night, for every witness who sat beneath the chandeliers and saw arrogance crumble before humility, the memory would linger forever. Because sometimes, in the most unexpected places, greatness is revealed. And when it is, it changes everyone who dares to see it.